There are different types of people. Can we all agree on that? That not everyone fits one model or one mold. Everyone is different. I mean, there are some who are more introverted than others, that if you didn't have to speak to another person the rest of your life, you wouldn't lose sleep over it. And then there are some who are more extroverted than others, as they can talk nonstop about pretty much anything. But spiritually, there are different types of people too, with different experiences, different outlooks, different responses. We're all just different. We might have a few things in common, but for the most part, we all have different spiritual experiences or church experiences or however you want to describe it. Tony Campolo is a preacher or was a preacher, and he tells the story of the time that he was invited to speak at a Presbyterian church. They wanted to pray over him before he spoke, so they went into a back room and they had him kneel because that was their practice. And 8 men placed their hands on his head and began to pray for him. Now, it seemed good at first, but those were older men, and they loved to pray really long prayers. But the longer they prayed, the more tired they got, and so they began to lean on Tony's head. He was struggling to try to keep focus and make matters worse. One of them wasn't even praying for Tony. He started praying for other people, especially one named Charlie Stoltzfus. Now, Tony remembered the prayer because it was so detailed. The man prayed, "Dear Lord, you know Charlie Stoltzfus. He lives in that silver trailer down the road a mile. You know the trailer, Lord, just down the road on the right-hand side." Tony remembered thinking, do you really believe you have to remind God where this Charlie guy lives? But the prayer continued, "Lord, Charlie told me this morning he's going to leave his wife and 3 kids. Step in and do something, God. Bring that family back together." Well, the men finally finished their praying, and Tony shared his message. And after the service was over, Tony left, and as he was leaving, he saw a hitchhiker on the turnpike, and he picked him up. And here's what happens next. Tony says that he drove a few minutes, and he said to him, "Hi, my name's Tony Campolo. What's yours?" And the guy said, "Charlie Stoltzfus." And Tony says he couldn't believe it, so he got off the turnpike at the next exit, and he headed back. The guy got a bit uneasy with that, and after a few minutes, he said, "Hey, where are you taking me?" And Tony says, "I'm taking you home." And Tony says that Charlie narrowed his eyes and asked, "Why?" And Tony looks and says, "Because you just left your wife and 3 kids, and I'm taking you back home." And Tony says, with a shock written all over the guy's face, he plastered himself against the car door, and he never took his eyes off of Tony. And Tony says, we drove to his house. And Tony says, I already had the directions. I knew right where I was going. And when I pulled up, the guy's eyes seemed to bulge as he asks, "How did you know that I lived here?" And Tony says, looked at him and said, "God told me." And when the man opened the trailer door and his wife comes out, she exclaims, "You're back, you're back." And Charlie starts to whisper in her ear, and the more he talked, the bigger her eyes got. And then Tony said to them, "The 2 of you sit down. I'm going to talk to you, and you're going to listen." And so Tony talked to them about marriage, about commitment, about scripture, and that afternoon he led those 2 young people to Christ. That is a great story. But there's one small problem with it. But we'll get back to that in a minute. In 2007, Jennifer and I were blessed with the opportunity to go and serve in Scotland for 2 weeks. And we did some amazing things, saw some amazing things. But it was the first time that I had ever traveled outside of the States. And it didn't take me long to learn that the expressions that I use, or that we use, are not always the same. It differs from place to place. For example, one night after we were done eating, I leaned back and I just said, "Oh, I'm stuffed." Harmless statement, right? Surely you've said it, or you know someone who says it often. Well, all the people started giggling at me, and I didn't understand why. Billy, the youth and children's minister there, leaned in and said, "Here, I'm stuffed means that I'm pregnant." Well, I learned that a few other things have really different meanings. Expressions are different. It's not always the same everywhere you look, everywhere you go. And yet for years, we've tried to put ours and everyone's spirituality into a box and say that it has to look a certain way, act a certain way. You have to be like a certain person. You have to match what my image of you is before you are acceptable. And yet expression is different. There are different types of people spiritually. There are those who are faith giants, who say they feel something in worship, that they're moved to tears and they cry over people. They cry over prayers. Their faith really can't be shaken no matter what. Now look at these people and I say, I should be more like that. Because see, being honest here, I'm in the other group who's trying their hardest just to make this work. And we hear stories like Charlie Stoltzfus and we say, man, I want a story like that. Why haven't I had an experience like that? Or how many times have I seen someone else, whether it was while I was at Harding, or maybe it's while I'm at camp, or at Impact, or anywhere. I see someone who's got their hands raised in the air and tears running down their face. And man, you can just tell they are worshiping God. And the thought comes across my mind, is there something wrong with me? There are those who often simply feel distant from God. And the point of this lesson is for all of us to understand that we don't have to fit someone else's model or mold. You don't have to act like, worship like, be like anyone else. Because God can use you. And it doesn't matter if you feel close to him or if you feel distant from him. Because he's still there. You ever read stories in the Bible and you wonder to yourself, why is that in there? And to me, that's what makes the Bible so amazing, because there are things in there that I would never want included. Not just the stories that would be embarrassing, but what about all the complaints and stories of failure? Stories like Jeremiah. If you've ever read Jeremiah, you might think, why is that even in there? Why do we have a book called Lamentations? Out of all the Psalms, 61 of them are laments or complaints. And then what about Paul? Paul was a great man. He did great things, but he died alone in a jail, cold. We know because he wrote asking for his coat. And by the end of his life, he wrote to Timothy and said that everyone in Asia had turned against him. Why is that even in there? You can read books like Hebrews. Some people say, oh, but the great faith chapter is in there. That's a great book if you only read the first half. Because the second half is about people being killed in gross and terrible ways. And they're not even mentioned by name. And yet there are people out there proclaiming health and wealth and name it and proclaim it. And that's what a lot of people want. To pretend to be happy, shiny people in a happy, shiny church. Even though it seems we don't really have a happy, shiny Bible. Oh, there's good news in it. But the people in it are far from perfect. The people in our world are far from perfect. You and I are far from perfect. And see, if we're going to trust the Bible, then we have to realize that not every prayer is answered. That everything that happens maybe isn't part of God's plan. And we need to stop thinking that we should be happy all the time, because honestly, that's not what I see when I read Scripture. And that's not where we all are. And some people may not understand this because they're kind of like best friends with God. They're so excited and maybe they don't really struggle with their relationship with God. And they have those Charlie Stoltzfus experiences. But then there's the other group. And see, that group, they really, really want to have that, but for some reason, they don't. We already talked about Abraham. Abraham was a great man, unless you look closely at him. He lied about his wife twice to protect his own hide. He shoved his other wife and son out into the wilderness. And we ended last time by looking at Abraham's test, which was offering his other son, Isaac. And maybe that's why Isaac had issues. Because I believe when you look at Isaac's life, you see that Isaac, at times, was distant from God. When you read Abraham's life, you see that Abraham was always interacting with God. That Abraham did so many things. When God spoke, Abraham jumped. And then you go over to Jacob, Isaac's son, and you see sort of the same thing again. Abraham and Jacob were two big prominent people in Scripture, but Isaac almost seems like a side note, like a transitional character. As a matter of fact, when you read Isaac's story in Genesis in chapters 21 through 35, he's not even really talked about that much. And when it's time to find a wife, like in Genesis chapter 24, the Bible doesn't even mention Isaac all that much. Abraham commissions his servant to go and find a wife for Isaac. He gives him all the instructions, tells him what to do. The servant goes and finds Rebekah, brings her back. Isaac has no choice in the matter. He has no say-so in the matter. As a matter of fact, if you've ever noticed, Scripture records Jacob or Isaac talking to his father as they're going up on Mount Moriah. After his father almost sacrifices him to God, Scripture doesn't record another word that Isaac says until he's well over 60 years old. And actually, if you read Isaac's story in those chapters, really the two big things that are about Isaac is him lying about his wife so that he wouldn't possibly be killed. He tricked the king, and he dug some wells. That's about it. He did build an altar after God spoke to him and reinforced the promise he made to Abraham. He did build an altar and worship God. But most of Isaac's story is either him tricking the king by lying about his wife, digging wells, or everything else is actually about someone else. Yeah, we see Isaac with Jacob and Esau, but that wasn't about Isaac. That was about Jacob and Esau. You kind of look at his story and you think, man, that's kind of sad. But I think it's important to realize that when you read Abraham, there's a lot of dialogue back and forth between Abraham and God. But when God speaks to Isaac, there isn't any dialogue. I believe what happened at Mount Moriah changed Isaac. I'd have to believe that being the son of a legend is hard. See, in Isaac's story, I think God was the last place that Isaac ran to. God wasn't safe. And it might have had something to do with Mount Moriah, because whenever your father's faith almost gets you killed, and you're told, just trust me, that might impact your ability to deal with God. I think because of his past experiences, Isaac was just trying to make it work. Isaac didn't sing the same songs as his father. He didn't have the same type of relationship that others before him had with God. And the thing that's amazing to me is that God accepts it. He never asks much from Isaac. Isaac even offers to leave Canaan, but God just tells him to stay put. In Genesis 26, just stay put. It's okay. Abraham went on a trip. Jacob went on a trip. Joseph goes on a trip, but Isaac stays. And God still used Isaac. He used him in a different way than he used Abraham. Then he would eventually use Jacob and Joseph and Moses, but he still used him. We tend to look at everyone around us and see what they're doing, what God is calling them to do, and wonder, why am I not doing something like that? We often see people starting ministries and doing great things and think, I need to be doing something like that to make a difference. We see people who are charismatic, who hold people with every word they speak, who are doing great things for the kingdom, and we assume that's what God needs to do, that's what God needs from us to do any good. And honestly, maybe God's just calling us to stay put. I'll use you where you're at. We look at others and think, man, look at how he worships. Look at how she prays. Look at how spiritual that person is. And we assume that's what a good Christian looks like. But many of us are Isaac. Many of us have the baggage of our past and it affects our relationship with God, and yet God still uses us. The church I grew up in affected my relationship with God for years. So much so to the point that where I would never step foot in a Church of Christ ever again. My family's faith affected my relationship with God. And the way we handle things in my family affects my relationship with God even today. I mean, still today, we don't really talk about our emotions very much. I can count on 3 fingers the times I've seen my dad cry. When my parents got divorced, when we got married, when me and Jennifer got married, and when his dad died. And so for me today, to be emotional, that's a very hard thing for me to do. It doesn't come naturally. And for some reason, I felt like it makes me less Christian because I'm not moved to tears over so many things. The church I was raised in didn't teach me that God was safe. God was mean and vengeful. That if I didn't do everything right and dot every I and cross every T, that God would stop loving me and I would have to work harder to gain his grace once again. I was kind of taught that we did the salvation hokey pokey, you know? You're in, you're out, you're in, you're out. That was the God I was taught about. And so loving God and feeling close to God was difficult because God was not safe. And so for the longest, I sat at the opposite end of the pew from God. Even today, I struggle with talking to God. Every once in a while, You run into someone we like to call a prayer warrior. I'm sure you have. You may even be one. But the one whose prayer life just floors you. That's not me. And see, I talk to God a few sentences at a time. I struggle with it because honestly, I was taught in a way that makes it difficult to deal with God. I am Isaac. And the thing that is comforting to me is that even when I feel distant from God, even if I hold him at arm's length sometimes, even if I do that, God accepts it, uses me, and blesses me. I think of Isaac, who struggled with his relationship with God, and yet God blesses him with Rebekah. And Isaac and Rebekah struggled for years to have children, and finally Isaac prays for his wife to have children, and God blesses them with children. I read that and I laugh because I get it. Sometimes the last thing I think about is praying. I try to handle it all by myself, and then I turn to God. I get it because I'm more like Isaac than I ever thought. It's not all bad with Isaac. It's not that he was a bad person. He loved God. He followed God. He built altars to God. Isaac was a great father and a great husband. He loved his children, and he gave all that he had to them. At the end of his life, all he had left was a blessing, and he gave it. Years later, when his two sons meet again, one's afraid that the other will kill him, but all there was hugging and forgiveness, and surely Isaac had something to do with that. It's not that he was a bad person. It's just that he had a different relationship with God, and yet God accepted it, and God used him. So what does this mean for us? Well, Psalm 139, 1 through 6 says, O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord. You go before me and follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too great for me to understand. God knows us. Before we even speak, God knows us. And he knows if we're struggling. He knows the past that we come from. He knows if we've been burnt. And he knows if we don't know exactly how to deal with him. He knows our gifts, and he knows our personalities, and he knows our abilities. He knows what we can do, and he knows what he can do with us. And so if you're the person who looks around and sees others worshiping God or following God differently, and you wish you could be just half as good as them, stop. Because God made you the way you are. So let him use you in only the ways he can. And if you're the person who looks around and determines that someone doesn't match your image of what they should what they should be and how they should be, stop. Because expressions are not always the same. Serving God doesn't always look the same. Their gifts may be different than yours. And maybe God just created them to be different than what you think they should be. Maybe he did that just to show you that he can use anyone. God has always called the broken, the unqualified, and he can use anyone for anything. You know, I told you at the beginning of this series, my hope was that we would be able to understand our story within his story, that we could find our story within the pages of God's story. And we do that by reading all these other people's stories first. And then we need to realize that not every story is the same. Not every person is the same. But God can use you where you are, with the talents that he has given you. You just got to stop trying to be like someone else or wishing for things that are not. And let God start using you today where you are. Next time, Jacob. Until then, have a blessed week.